struggled legendarily with transit. In the State of the City address, the mayor put forth an ambitious education plan starting with transportation, getting Detroiters to the schools they want to attend, in a way, marrying public schools with charter schools. That was just part of the address, which also included a projection that will have the city of Detroit out of state financial oversight, as the mayor put it, about 30 years ahead of schedule after the city's bankruptcy. We then learned that Wayne County finally has its deal with Dan Gilbert to build a new criminal justice complex on the east edge of downtown that would seem to end the long and embarrassingly expensive Wayne County jail debacle. But then the fur started to fly in Washington. Against the advice of many on his own team, President Trump turned his protectionist trade talk into policy. He will now levy tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. It was something his chief economic advisor couldn't stomach. He quit. But what about the Motor City? Are the cutouts for Canada and Mexico enough, or does this spell big trouble for a region that relies on steel and aluminum in a very singular way? We're going to talk about that this morning. And a little later on, former Michigan Congressman David Bonnier. He's got a new book out on what it was like for a devout liberal to live through the conservative revolution, and can he see any way to bring everyone together today? We'll ask him this morning on Flashpoint. Yeah, two big pieces of news from the White House last week, an upcoming meeting, of course, between the president and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But we're going to focus on the other big announcement. The president says trade wars can be good and that they're easy to win. Well, he may be launching one, and according to one study, it could cost the U.S. 45,000 auto jobs. Let's talk about it this morning with a group of people who's, all of you, I think it's your business basically to talk to the businesses in our neck of the woods and get their pulse on things. I'm curious as to what you're hearing. Dustin Walsh is here, senior reporter from Crain's Detroit Business. Michelle Krebs back with us, analyst for Auto Trader. Daniel Howes is the business columnist for the Detroit News, and Brad Williams is the vice president for government affairs for the Detroit Regional Chamber. Gang, thanks for being here. Dustin, let me start with you. I'm going to have to say at the outset, I guess we're kind of spitballing this because who knows what these are going to be and who they're actually going to end up being levied against. But the takeaway for the Motor City is what?
Jobs are at risk. I mean, when you look at what happens with these sort of tariffs and trade barriers, it's going to impact the automotive industry. We don't know who's going to get a carve out, right? We don't know. They did mention today that there would be certain products that could be carved out. So we don't know if that's going to include castings, because wheels, they come from a lot of places and usually not the United States. So we don't know where it's going to fall and who's going to get the favorable treatment.
It's interesting, Michelle, by the time you get done creating these set-asides like this and you set aside certain countries, are there any teeth left in it anyway?
Well, it's yet to be seen.
Wilbur Ross, to hear him, none of this is really going to, of course, my question is always, if it doesn't really end up amounting to much, why do it? But he makes it sound like it's really not going to be that much of a deal.
Except that we're at a very important time in the auto cycle. We're on the downward side, and there's already, we're anticipating sales will fall again this year. They hit a record in 2016. They've been going down since, and this won't help.
Yeah.
So any kind of, and we already know a lot of that's an affordability issue with people. So anything more you add to the cost of the vehicle, and interest rates are going up, so that's making car loans go up. So it comes at a not great time.
Yeah. Daniel, your take on this?
Well, I think that's right, and there's also the knock-on effect of tit-for-tat retaliation, and to what extent that slows down the general economy at a time when the cycle is slowing. This isn't going to be good, and this wasn't very well thought out. If you really had problems with dumping, focus on the Chinese, focus on the Russians, focus on the Brazilians, but the Canadians, we buy more steel from Canada than any other place. And while they said the Canadians and the Mexicans would be exempt, it's conditional. It's conditional on whether the president gets what he thinks he wants and he deserves out of NAFTA negotiations. So he could just very easily say, you know what, I don't like what you're doing. So guess what? We're not going to slap tariffs on you too.
The business world tends to really be allergic to uncertainty, and this would seem to be.
Oh, they absolutely are. Look, financially, I don't think this is going to be a big hit to the car companies in terms of their bottom line. Barclays said it would be about $250 million roughly for Ford in 2018, maybe 214, I think, if I remember the numbers right, for General Motors. Not huge hits, something they can absorb, but that's not really the point. It starts to really complicate doing business.
Well, here's what the study said from the Council of Foreign Relations. Brad, I'll let you respond to this. They said with a 25% tariff, you would see a 1.3% rise in the cost of a vehicle, which would mean a 4% drop in sales worldwide for the U.S. automakers, which would mean, to their reckoning, and I know, Michelle, you're still trying to digest how they came to these numbers, but to this study from, the Foreign Relations Council, 45,000 U.S. auto jobs.
Yeah, and there's no question that we should all be concerned about that. Again, this is a relatively new study, so you still have to look a little bit at the numbers, but I think the larger point that Daniel started to make is right, that with the carve-outs right now for Canada and Mexico, I think this speaks to the larger uncertainty around trade within the North American corridor. Canada and Mexico account for 25% of our steel imports in the country. And if we're going to use this as part of a leveraging tactic on NAFTA, I think that creates even more uncertainty for the business community, manufacturers, agriculture in particular, as to what the future of NAFTA is, which is so very vital, particularly in this region, to our economic success.
And the biggest infrastructure problem in the nation of Canada is this new bridge, which is entirely built on the idea of trade between our countries.
The politics of this make no sense either. The industrial Midwest made Donald Trump president, okay?
Except this is what I was going to get to. This is exactly what he promised during the campaign. He talked about levying, being a far more protectionist president.
But not to the expense of the auto industry, which is a heck of a lot bigger than the steel industry.
Does that count? Or go ahead, Michelle.
Well, and I was going to say, we brought up this idea of uncertainty. The auto industry is a long lead kind of business with a very complicated supplier network. And that kind of uncertainty makes it all the worse.
Difficult to plan.
How do you plan? You can't turn on a dime.
I've come up against this a lot with when I talk to Trump supporters. Every time he does something that a lot of the rest of the world sort of sees as outrageous, you go back, it's something that he promised he would do from the get-go, whether it was a tax cut, on and on.
Acting surprised about this is sort of disingenuous, right? But what it comes down to is it's all about trade deficits with him. He wanted tariffs because he believes that that's an impact to trade deficits. That's a completely misguided approach. We look at trade deficits, it's our consumers spend a lot more than the other country's consumers. So going after trade to narrow that gap isn't going to work. It's only going to harm us. It's a small effect to our consumer spending. So really, I mean, mandatory 401k, limiting our spending and saving more, passing a budget that is smaller would also help the trade deficit.
Daniel, you spent a lot of time in Europe. You were the Free Press bureau chief there for a while.
Please.
Yeah. And, yes, I'm sorry to tell you news. Wow. But in 2016, Europe slapped a huge tariff on cheap Chinese steel, like 75% almost. And there wasn't a huge dust up there. So how much of this is to, I guess, to some Trump supporters, no matter what he does, the media wants to jump all over it, and it really doesn't necessarily match the real impact of what it's saying.
It's not even just about the price of foreign steel. I mean, the reality is that, again, take an example like Ford. You know, I think they get 95% of their steel comes from U.S. suppliers and 98% of their aluminum. But the prices are already going up. So whatever happens in the marketplace, however the foreigners are impacted, the domestics are going to raise their prices. You know, they're capitalists at the end of the day. And if the overall price is 25% higher for steel, it's going to go up higher for domestic steel. That's just a reality. And so, you know, in terms of the Europeans, I don't know. But I can tell you this, they are going to respond. They're not going to sit here and take this. And I think a lot of people make this assumption that somehow the President of the United States is king of the world. These people run sovereign countries. They're going to respond, and they're going to do it in ways to maximize pressure on members of Congress. It's no accident that the EU said they were going to raise tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which are built right in their Paul Ryan's district, on Kentucky bourbon, where Mitch McConnell comes from, and Levi jeans, which is where Nancy Pelosi comes from. I mean, they're not stupid.
Yeah. Hard to miss the symbolism of the first three.
Poor Chuck Schumer got left out of it.
Yeah.
I think to build off to what Daniel was just saying regarding China, it's important to remember that China isn't even one of the top 10 exporters of steel to the United States. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office has taken 24 remedial actions against China to stop dumping and price undercutting. So this is not even a China issue. I mean, as I said before, Canada and Mexico represent 25% of our steel imports, and the EU is our second largest importer of steel and some of our best allies in the world.
Michelle, can you see any sectors here in Southeast Michigan, though, that can benefit? Is there a constituency for it, I guess, somewhere?
I mean, I don't think so in the big picture of things, because I think Daniel's right, that prices will go up. And, you know, the auto companies learned a big lesson from the Great Recession. They're focused on profitability, and they'll do what they have to do, be disciplined about maintaining that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dustin, I guess the other part of this is people have wondered how much of this is a wag the dog. Better than talking about Stormy Daniels, better than talking about any number, better than talking about Russia. Let's move the conversation, which is something that the president has proved pretty adroit at.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. At the end of the day, everyone's going to come and they're going to carve out, and they're going to continue to carve out for everyone that wants a carve out, because they're going to realize the numbers don't add up, and then we're going to be left with pretty much a toothless trade platform on this, and we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, it's largely to not talk about the other things that are going on.
Well, and the lack of preparedness.
Which is what we're doing right now.
Right. Exactly.
We're talking about trade.
But the lack of preparedness for this is very telling. I mean,
it was
auto
a
companies,
for tariffs.
They didn't know what they were doing. The White House couldn't answer questions. The president tweeted this. They didn't know what they were doing.
And to Michelle's point, they're not making decisions for next week.
And by the way, we saw this twice this week, and we same thing with North Korea. It's like, boom. He says, "Okay, yeah, I'll have the meeting."
It was pretty clear Rex Tillerson did not know that was coming.
or whoever else in the national security staff.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very, very potentially huge deal for the United States and for the world, frankly. It's no accident that there has been how many presidents that have not been even thought about meeting with the North Korean leader, and I believe has never happened in the history of the relationship.
And Brad, it's creating a really interesting dynamic in North America, which we've always kind of seen as a pretty, at least as continents go, pretty copacetic sort of relationship among the three nations. We've got a fight over walls. We've got a fight over upcoming over NAFTA. It's kind of shaking the ground underneath our feet a little bit.
Yeah, and businesses are always looking for certainty and trying to avoid uncertainty. This is just another example of uncertainty that we're seeing coming forward. Our economy, particularly in this region with Canada, is fully integrated. We have to have certainty. We have to recognize that Canada, they are our best friends, both diplomatically and economically, and we need to keep them close and allow our economy to continue to grow together.
Boy, if I was advising Prime Minister Trudeau, I would advise him to push back and not put up with this stuff. If we are the best friends, and then you ought to treat us that way.
Even with the cutout for them.
Well, the cutout's conditional.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
The cutout is conditional. The cutout is, you know, we'll cut this out, cut you out of this if you give me what I want on NAFTA.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an extra stick.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
I got to get to a break. Thanks, gang, for the conversation. Appreciate it very much. We'll be joined by former Michigan Congressman David Bonnier when Flashpoint continues. David Bonnier was, of course, a fixture in Michigan politics for a long time. Perhaps we were too close to recognize or always remember that to many across the country, he was largely the face of progressivism. Well, what's a progressive to do in an era like this? His new book is Whip. leading the progressive battle during the rise of the right. And our guest today, former Michigan Congressman David Bonnier. Great to see you again.
Nice to be
Thanks for being here. I'm really curious about so many different things, but what I want to start with, though, was really jarring for me to start looking at your positions and where they might be today. You were one of the most strident opponents of NAFTA. You didn't like a lot about what was going on in American trade policy, and I thought, wow, here's David Bonnier aligned with the current president, Donald Trump.
Well, not entirely aligned, but we both saw the flaws in NAFTA. NAFTA created tremendous economic chaos, especially for the industrial Midwest, put a lot of people out of work, about 1 million people, ran up a $181 billion deficit annually, and then the people who were able to get jobs again weren't able to get really good paying jobs. I mean, they ended up in service and retail jobs at probably 20–25% less than they were making. And the people in Mexico who this was supposed to help, the poverty rate has increased, almost doubled in some of those areas in Mexico. So it's not worked for the average working person in the world today, in the United States, Canada, or Mexico, to help the people at the top. But that's been the story, though, for the last 30 years.
Would you agree, though, that it's time for a trade war and that they're fairly easy to win?
Well, it's time to level the playing field on some of these situations. And yes, I think, for instance, the steel situation, the Chinese got away with quite a bit over decades, and I think we needed to level the field there.
I want to ask you a little bit, not only about the rise of the right in Washington and what it's ended up meaning for where we are nationally, politically, but also about what's happened to, I guess, what we would think of as political civility, which the Detroit Regional Chamber recently spent a lot of time on, and the atmosphere in Washington where you could disagree as disagreeably as you wanted, but then somehow go out to dinner with somebody that night. That seems to have evaporated.
It did, and I think one of the reasons is that they're not there long enough. They come in on Tuesday, for the most part. They fly in, get their votes at the end of the day, just in time to get the votes. They're there Wednesday. And then on Thursday, they're gone in the afternoon by 2, so they can catch their planes and go home. So most people don't bring their families there anymore. When I was elected back in '76, you brought your family there. You came back to your districts maybe every other weekend. Their pressure is for them to be home all the time, and so the work of the country just doesn't get done. And the relationship building that you need in order to get the work done does not get done because they're not there. There's hardly enough time to know your own staff, let alone the other party.
Is the source of that pressure the idea that you need to be connecting with your constituents, or is it to be back raising money for the next election cycle?
Well, it's a little of each. And you do have to be there for your constituents, but I was there, and most of my colleagues that I served with were there for their constituents. They went back and were there. But it's important to spend some time and get the business of the country done. One of the other things that we engaged in, and we would have athletic events that we would compete with each other, that we'd have an annual or regular basketball game, for instance, where we'd play in the gym, Democrats, Republicans on the same side, and you learn that, who hogs the ball, who passes the ball, who's a good sport, who's not a good sport, and you develop
it extends to the floor.
Right, and then we'd have this annual congressional baseball game that's been 100 years old. We'd raise a couple $100,000 for local charities, and that was a great lot of fun, and you get the kid around and meet and understand other people's lives and their families. You'd meet members of the Republican families. We'd have picnics and other things. You develop relationships, and when you get to know somebody and you kind of like them, it's harder to be nasty to them or to disagree with them. It's more easy to actually try to work something out.
Let's talk about where we are right now. When you look at the rise of the right that you talk about here, I think some would counter and say that we saw the rise of the left in the Bernie Sanders movement, and as some people pointed out, they weren't that. They were kind of just different sides of the same coin. They were both speaking to a great deal of frustration that we have in America right now.
Well, there is a great deal of frustration, and the Sanders movement was quite successful, I think, in bringing a lot of new people into the process, which we haven't had in a long time, which was terribly important. I think it was successful in breaking the money cycle, where he was able to run a very financially buoyant campaign because he was getting small donations, relatively small, $27 per person. And so he did some very positive things, and he raised issues that hadn't been raised before. So he did a great service, I think, in his run.
He is older. A lot of the leading Democrats that we point to right now, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, are in political terms older.
Right.
Where are the young lions that of this young progressive, what we would expect to be a young progressive movement?
Well, they're waiting. Believe me, they're out there and they're waiting, and they're waiting for the turnover. And I think we do need a refreshing turnover in leadership at all levels of government, just not in Congress, but you need it in local government, and you need it in state government, and we need some new fresh blood and new innovative, interesting thinking. And so there's a time to step aside. I was elected, I was fortunate, I was 27 when I was in the State House, and I got elected at 31, spent 26 years, so I left at age 57, but it's very difficult with the energy you need to do a good job when you're up there in age. And so I think we need that refreshing.
And it does block those other
It blocks other people.
The last thing I wanted to talk about then with you is how do we get it all back together? We seem so diametrically opposed in so many different ways.
Yeah.
The vitriol is every night on the cable news networks. Can you see us coming back together without something awful happening to bring us back together?
I can see us coming together, and I think we will. I mean, did you see the movie Lincoln? Did you remember the pieces that they did on the House and the Senate?
Yeah.
You think this was pretty bad stuff? It was even worse then. Now, that's not to say that they both were good, but I think we have more in common than we have in opposition to each other. We have our basic humanity, number one, so we ought to treat each other with some decency and respect. And then secondly, I'm really encouraged by the fact that people are starting to pick things up that the politicians don't want to do. For instance, this shooting in Parkland. These kids have taken this by the bull by the horns here and are leading a movement, and they're going to have a big rally here on the 24th of March all over the country. And I'm associated with a group called the Mikvah Challenge, which I work with high school kids, juniors and seniors in Washington, D.C., and I'm trying to bring the program to Michigan. The proceeds for this book go to that very program. All of the proceeds go for bringing the Mikvah Challenge into Michigan and other places. So these kids can have the opportunity and the experience to participate and lead us.
And now that you know that, maybe you'll want to get a copy of Whip, Leading the Progressive Battle During the Rise of the Right by David Bonnier. It is out from City Point Press, and it's out right now. Great to have you here, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for being here.
Nice to be here.
And we'll be back to wrap things up this morning for Flashpoint right after this.
March.
Big week ahead in Detroit. The regionals will be held at Little Caesars Arena in the NCAA basketball tourney coming up later this week. The bids come out tonight. Good luck to both Michigan and Michigan State. Thanks so much for being here. Meet the Press is coming up next right after Mitch Albom's Heart of Detroit. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday right back here for Flashpoint.